Okay, unfortunately, this is a very anti-Semitism is always a relevant topic, and sometimes it's a bit more relevant than others. And unfortunately, we're living through that time of a time period. But it's very important to understand, and there actually is a Torah perspective on anti-Semitism, and it's something that will teach us a lot of important principles about anti-Semitism and also about how do we appreciate what it means to be Jewish. So first of all, the term itself, anti-Semitism, is a strange term because there's a lot of generic terms you could use. You could talk about bigotry, you could talk about xenophobia, racism. These are generic terms that can apply to different groups. But there's a term, anti-Semitism, which is hatred of the Jew, specifically. So the world understands, because there's a term, hatred of the Jew, the world understands there's something different about this phenomena than other terrible hatreds in the world. Okay, and that's what we try to understand. Now, when we talk about anti-Semitism, we could say, why is it? What's causing it? When we ask that question, we could talk about reasons or excuses. And it's very simple to know the difference. If it's truly a reason, then you remove the reason, and then the phenomena stops. If it's an excuse, then it looks like it's associated, but at the end of the day, even when the phenomena is gone, if it still continues, you see that was really an excuse. It wasn't really the reason. And of course, the kinds of things that are usually talked about as reasons are usually excuses. They're simply people trying to say, what is it that's unusual or distinctive about Jews? Because they're successful, so it's jealousy, or maybe they're the outsider, and therefore they're bothered by that, or even though, of course, there's always a lot of counterexamples, and that shows you that's not truly the reason. So we're going to try to understand what the Torah perspective says is the true reason. Now, there are many unusual aspects of anti-Semitism that make it a unique phenomena. It's universal. Almost every country the Jews were ever living in, at one point or another, threw them out. They were thrown out from England, France, Hungary, Austria, Spain, Lithuania, Portugal. Many, many countries were actually tossed out of the whole country. And in more recent years, when the state of Israel was established, almost all the Jews in the Arab countries were also thrown out of those countries. So it's a universal phenomena. It's a very intense phenomena. We see during the Holocaust that the Germans wanted to destroy every last Jew in the entire world. Incredible level of intensity. It's also a long phenomena. It's been going on for over 2,000 years, and specifically, the most powerful empires or groups are the ones that were attacking us. The Greeks, the Romans, the Catholic Church, and then in the previous century, Germany, the Soviet Union, the Arabs. And what's remarkable is that the groups and empires that attacked us were quite powerful. So it's curious that they were threatened in some way by the Jewish people. That's the longevity. And then it's irrational, because there's something that's very strange about it. Whatever we're doing, it seems to be the reason for the anti-Semitism. I mentioned last night, my talk then, I mentioned that the Jew, I always feel the classic example of irrationality is the blood libels, because we're the most careful people in the world to avoid blood, even when we eat regular meat. And yet, you have the Christians who have a ritual of drinking red wine, which ritualistically they call blood, and we are blood avoiders, and they're accusing us of this horrible type of a charge that we're killing non-Jewish children to drink their blood. So you have the blood drinkers accused of the blood avoiders. So it's bizarre. We're the only people that was ever accused of what's called deicide, killing God, which itself is a pretty bizarre type of a charge to make against someone.
Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of England, wrote about anti-Semitism. He said, of all the extreme fanaticism that plays havoc in man's nature, there's none as irrational as anti-Semitism. The Jews cannot vindicate themselves in the eyes of these fanatics. The Jews are rich, the victims of theft and extortion. If they are poor, the victims of ridicule. They take sides in a war, must be the one to gain advantage from spilling of non-Jewish blood. If they espouse peace, it must be they're scared or traitors to the country. The Jew dwells in a foreign land, he is persecuted and expelled, he wants to return to his own country, it's prevented from doing so. Whatever the Jew is doing, that's given as a reason for the anti-Semitism. Now, what I want to do now sounds a bit strange at first. It's to take various quotes from the Nazis, Yamak Shemam, and use that to try to understand anti-Semitism. So it seems very strange, but in a certain sense, maybe it's not so strange. They're the greatest Jew haters, so maybe they do understand something about what the Jewish people are and why they were obsessed with us. So first of all, you have Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. He writes, 50 or 100 years from now, National Socialism, that's the Nazi ideology, that will become a philosophic system that can be studied at the universities for 4 or 5 semesters, just as today, theology or classical economics are academic subjects. He wanted to say, don't look at us as being a bunch of irrational fanatics. We have a system, we have a logic and a system to understand why we attack the Jews. And we can study it. It could be studied in universities. So, well, what's remarkable is we'll see there really is something to the system. So these are a bunch of direct quotes now from Hitler himself, Yamak Shemo. He wrote, it's the Jew who struggles for his dominion over the nations. He looked at it as a truly international, universal struggle. He called the Jews the greatest danger of all peoples to the earth, greatest of all dangers to the peoples. He called Judaism the plague of the world. He said there's either 2 possibilities, victory of the Aryan or annihilation of the Aryan and victory of the Jew. And perhaps the clearest statement of how obsessed he was just before he killed himself in his bunker in Berlin. He issued a statement to the nation. He demanded of all Germans, all National Socialists, men, women, and men of the armed forces, they be faithful and obedient to death to the new government and its president. And then he concluded, above all, I charge the leaders of the nation and those under them to scrupulous observance of the laws of race and to merciless opposition to the universal poisoner of all peoples, international Jewry. Now, in a speech he gave in Nuremberg in 1923, he said a strange thing. He said, unless we expel the Jewish people soon, they will have Judaized our people within a very short time. And that's strange because it sounds like he's saying, we're going to keep our values and then the Germans will get our values from us. When in fact, just the opposite was happening. We were abandoning our values and taking on their values. So understand this. There's another idea that he talked about 2 other groups that he was also very bothered by and very obsessed by. Christianity and Bolshevism. Now, aside from the fact that all 3, Christianity, Bolshevism, and Judaism, all have a basic Jewish connection, but there's also something about their ideology which is similar. All 3 of them focus on the weak members of society. The Christians talk about the weak inheriting the earth. The Christians talk about, the Bolsheviks, the communists talk about the proletariat, the lowly worker. They focus on him. We talk about the idea of tzedakah, helping the widow and the orphan. So there's an idea that all 3 systems are focusing on the weak members of society. Now, there's an idea called social Darwinism, which is the idea that just like Darwinism is survival of the fittest, social Darwinism is survival of the strongest society. And he wanted the German to be the strongest society. And he felt that the weakness that the Jews and these other systems were promoting would be the undoing of his vision. So he writes the following. This is probably the most extreme quote. It's a collection of about 2 or 3 different quotes about his ideology. He said, "It is true, we are barbarians. That is an honored title to us. I free humanity from the shackles of the soul, for the degrading suffering caused by the false vision called conscience and ethics. The Jews have inflicted two wounds on mankind: circumcision on its body and conscience on its soul. They are Jewish inventions. The war for domination of the world is waged only between the two of us, the Germans and the Jews. Everything else is but deception. So to appreciate this quote, we have to go back to the Jewish concept of a human being. A human being has a spiritual component and a physical component, a body and a soul. And of course, our goal is that every human being should identify with and express the spiritual part, whereas the Germans were focused on the physical part. We could say perhaps that while our messianic utopian vision is a world where everybody identifies as a spiritual being, as a soul, as the primary aspect of who we are, the Germans' messianic vision was the opposite. It was to focus and to identify as physical beings. And therefore, they saw us as being the polar opposite of themselves. And what's interesting is that even though the Jews in Germany were quite assimilated, that was in terms of basic Jewish observance. But in terms of the idea that we value tzedakah, helping the widowly orphan, helping the underdog, those were things that the Jews had, and they were influenced German society with. So in that sense, we were, as he put it, Judaizing the German people, because we were given this ideology of help the weak members of society. Now, I'll read the bigger part of that quote, what I read before, and you'll see the bigger context of it. He wrote, the internal expurgation of the Jewish spirit is not possible in any Platonic way, for the Jewish spirit is the product of the Jewish person. Unless we expel the Jewish people soon, they will have Judaized our people within a very short time. And it's interesting to contrast this quote I just read with a different quote he had about Christianity. So he wrote there, the world will come to an end. Then we must consider the last great task of this era is to solve the problem of the churches. Only then will the German nation be secure. So it's very fascinating to appreciate the difference in his perspective on Judaism and Christianity. When it came to Christianity, the goal was to eliminate the church, the institution itself, not the Christian people. When it came to the Jews, you understood the goal is to get rid of the Jew himself. It's not the synagogue. So you understood something which we ourselves talk about. Every Jew is fundamentally connected to Jewish values. A person can be secular, but that internal Jewish spark, the pintaliid, is always there and always has those Jewish values. And he understood, even if someone's very, very secular, they have that Jewish connection in themselves, not just in the institution itself of the synagogue. Okay, now I'm going to receive some other quotes from others about anti-Semitism, and we'll see a certain similarity. Jean-Paul Sartre, well-known French writer and philosopher, he's in a book called Anti-Semite and Jew. He wrote, he, the anti-Semite, is a man who's afraid. He's afraid of his consciousness, his liberty, and his instincts, and his responsibilities, of change and the world. Anti-Semitism, in short, is fear of the human condition, or we could say perhaps fear of being human as opposed to being an animal, having fear of that spiritual quality which we all have as human beings. Sigmund Freud addressed the puzzle of how can it be that the Christians who share our values, who borrowed our values, I should say, that they were the greatest anti-Semites throughout history. I mean, till recent times. They were always the ones leading the charge against us, against the Jewish people. So he wrote, very interestingly, we must not forget that all the peoples who now excel in the practice of anti-Semitism became Christians only in relatively recent times, sometimes forced to it by bloody compulsion. One might say that they're all badly christened. Under the thin veneer of Christianity, they remained where their ancestors were, barbarically polytheistic. They have not yet overcome their grudge against the new religion which was forced on them, and they projected it onto the source from which Christianity came to them. The hatred for Judaism is at bottom hatred for Christianity. And Professor Franklin Littell, a Methodist who was a scholar in both anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, wrote, "Anti-Semitism is rebellion against the Jewish God. Christian anti-Semitism is rebellion against the Jewish God. It's hatred of the law. Christians can't hate Jesus, but they can hate the Jewish God and they can hate the law. Their hatred of the Jew is hatred of the people that reminds them of their failing." Dennis Prager, a very well-known author and popular radio personality, wrote a book about anti-Semitism called Why the Jews? He wrote the following in an article about anti-Semitism. He said, "To the anti-Semite, the Jews are the embodiment of fundamental moral values of the Western world. It's those values, and ultimately all those who hold those values, that the anti-Semites seek to destroy. The Jews are only their first target. Anti-Semitism is a Jewish problem. But non-Jews make a very self-destructive error when they dismiss it as only the Jews' problem. Treatment of the Jews has served as one of humanity's moral barometers. Watch how nations, individuals, or ideologies react to the Jewish people or the Jewish state. You will have an early and deadly accurate picture of their values and their intentions. The Jews are the world's miner's canary. Miners take canaries into the mine because canaries are particularly vulnerable to the fumes there. And they die before the miners are aware of the fumes. And then people know they have to get out of there. So it is with the Jews. Moral non-Jews who fail to act against anti-Semites and anti-Zionists will in due course suffer from them. Jew haters begin with Jews, but never end with Jews. And that's why anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism should be so important to non-Jews. Identifying the Jews' enemies gives a civilized society an unparalleled opportunity to identify the forces that also wish to destroy them. And finally, Rashi's fundamental commentary on the Torah spells out the classical Jewish understanding of anti-Semitism. Rashi is addressing a puzzle in the Pesukim. This is near the end of the book of Bamidbar. The background to this is that God told Moshe to fight against the nation of Midian, who had attacked the Jewish people for no good reason, as a vengeance for the Jewish people. When Moshe tells the Jews to fight against Midian, he changes the statement. He says we're going to fight against Midian as a nekamas Hashem, a vengeance for God. So how can Moshe do that? Hashem tells Moshe, fight against them as a nekama, a vengeance for the Jewish people. And Moshe says, no, we're fighting for a vengeance for God. And Rashi explains in very, very succinct terms. He said, because whoever stands against Israel is as if they're standing against God. It's the same thing. In a similar way, the Gemara tells us that the mountain upon which the Torah was given was called Mount Sinai. It makes a play on Sinai and Sina, the word for hatred. And it tells us that once God gave the Torah, the system of absolute morality to the world, then hatred, Sina, came down to the non-Jewish world. Now, I heard a beautiful insight about anti-Semitism from Rav Matas Weinberg, my Rosh Yeshiva's nephew. It's based on a very cryptic section in Sefer Bereshit called the Bris Bein Basarim. And there, God promises Avram that he will inherit Eretz Yisrael forever. And Avram asks the very problematic question, B'ma'ida, how will I know? Rashi explains two understandings of the question. What was Avram asking? Hashem tells tells Avram, you will inherit Eretz Yisrael forever. And Avram replies, how do I know? B'ma'ida. So Rashi explains, what was he asking? He was either asking for a tangible sign, or he was asking by what merit will the Jews inherit the land forever. Now it could be that the first interpretation of Rashi shows the question was a mistake, that Avram was asking in perhaps some subtle way a lack of trust in God. But the second explanation that Rashi gives, by what merit will they inherit it, doesn't sound like a mistake at all. It sounds actually very logical. So, if you think about the whole concept of chosen people, which is expressed by Eretz Yisrael being given to the Jews forever, so it's a bit of a problem here. I mean, Avram, of course, is very loyal to God. It's very logical that God picks in a relationship with Avram. But once he picks a relationship with Avram and his descendants, now you've got a problem. Because who says his descendants will always be loyal? So there seems like there's two possibilities. Either God can force the Jews to always be loyal, but then there's no relationship because it's just compulsion, or they have free will to be loyal or not be loyal. But then, of course, some Jews are going to not be loyal, but then they're the chosen people, and that's problematic. How can that be? So that's so to speak, that's like the divine dilemma, so to speak. Hashem is what do I do now? How do I make it that the Jews will make choice? So there's a relationship here, and yet be sure that they'll always stay loyal. At least a portion of us always stay loyal. How will that work? So we see two statements in the Passover Haggadah that gives us an insight into this. First we say, Baruch Shomer Haftachaso Yisrael, blessed is the one who keeps his promises to Israel. Blessed be he. And this is based on the Bris Bein Basarim, the covenant that God made with Avram. So that it goes on to say that God calculated the end of our captivity to fulfill what he had said to Avram at this covenant. He said the following, know with certainty, your offspring will be strangers in a land not theirs, which is Egypt. And they will serve them, and they will oppress your offspring for 400 years. Then I will judge the nation whom they will serve, and after that they will go out with great wealth. And then right after that, in the Haggadah, we have the very well-known passage of Vehi Sha'amta. It is this that has stood for our fathers and for us. For not only one has risen against us to destroy us, but in all generations they rise up against us to destroy us, and God saves us from their hands. So it's very puzzling. These are two very puzzling pieces. Because we're saying that the first one being God keeps his promises. Now that's wonderful. It's wonderful that God keeps his promises. But it's a bit of a funny example to use. To say, yeah, he promised we go to slavery in Egypt, and guess what? He kept his promise. It's a bit of a curious example of one that we're so happy God kept his promise on. Okay? And then Vehi Sha'amta is telling us, what is it that stood for us, for our fathers and for us? Two things. First is they'll rise up against us to destroy us in every generation. Secondly, he'll save us from their hands. So it seems to be that both are what's going to keep us going. Both of them meaning to say, not only he'll save us, but they will attack us. And that's anti-Semitism. It seems to be that anti-Semitism plus God saving us at some point in the process is what stood for us for all generations. So how is that? Now I believe the answer to these questions is found in a mashal. Imagine there's a steep mountain road. The road's on the edge of the mountain. And of course, there's guardrails on the edge of that road to make sure that cars stay on the road. And imagine that you're driving your car up the mountain road, but you were driving up after the Project Inspire convention. You're a bit tired because you were up, you didn't get any sleep because you were staying up for all the amazing classes. You're a bit tired, dozing off a little bit as you're driving up the mountain road. And you're getting more and more sleepy, and pretty soon you kind of doze off, and the car starts sliding off the road till it gets to the guardrails at the edge of the road. And all of a sudden it hits the guardrails and there's a big scraping, banging noise. Quickly you wake up, grab the wheel, turn it back onto the road, and you're there. You stop the car to survey the damage. You get out and your car is a mess. It's all dented, it's all scraped up, it's in a terrible state. Could you imagine at that point saying to yourself, who was the idiot that put these guardrails here? Look what it did to my car. Probably not. You probably wouldn't say that. Because, of course, as much as you're not happy with the damage to your car, it's a lot better than the alternative. That, I believe, is anti-Semitism. It's the guardrails. Meaning to say, you're on the road. When you stay on the road, do you have a problem for the guardrails? No. They're there to make sure you don't go off the road. When you're on the road, you're okay. But you start sliding off the road, you hit the guardrails, and it bumps you, it pushes you back onto the road. And we see this many places in Jewish history. For example, in Sefer Shoftim, we find that many places it talks about the Jews doing bad things, then they're attacked and persecuted, then they do tshuva, they spiritually improve, then God sends a prophet or a deliverer to save them, and they have peace and quiet until they do some more bad in a different area. And then again, they're attacked. Then again, they do tshuva. And then again, there's a savior. And they have peace and quiet. And this goes on a number of times. At any point in that process, had there not been the attack to spur us to do tshuva, what would have happened? We would have gone off the road. That pushed us back on the road. Now, there's no way to really understand anti-Semitism unless we appreciate the crucial importance of us being a chosen people. Once God picked Avram, who became Avraham, and his descendants, it was essential for the sake of the world and for us that we fulfill our role. We have to do our job for ourselves and for the world. And when we do our job properly, things go well for us, relatively speaking. When we don't, things are bad for us. And we get knocked back on the road in sometimes a very, very painful, difficult way. Rav Chaim Volozhin, one of the primary students of the Vilna Gaon, expressed this very sharply. He said, unless the Jews make Kiddush, the non-Jews will make Havdalah. Meaning to say, if we live as a Kiddush Hashem, sanctify God's name in the world, we're good. But if not, the non-Jews will make Havdalah. They'll separate us from them, and they'll force us back on our track, back on our mission. A striking example of this is found in a particular quote in a letter written to a German government minister in 1925. The person wrote in the following in the letter. He said, when I first came to Germany 15 years ago, I discovered for the first time that I was a Jew. And I owe this discovery more to Gentiles than to Jews. If we did not have to live amongst intolerant, narrow-minded, and violent people, He said, I'd be the first one to throw off all national socialism, all nationalism in favor of universal humanity. Who wrote that letter? Albert Einstein. And one last quote. Who knows? It might even be a religion from which the world and all peoples learn good. And for that reason alone, do we now suffer. We can never become just Netherlanders, or just English, or representatives of any other country for that matter. We will always remain Jews. That was written in the very famous diary of Anne Frank. It's critically important that we understand anti-Semitism, because we understand anti-Semitism, we can understand why Jews are so hated. We'll also understand who we are, our role in the world, and that may be the deepest insight of all into anti-Semitism. I'm going to close with a story. It's a very powerful story, and this goes back to the early days of Aish Torah. And this is a 100% true story. I know all the people involved in the story, so I can tell you, I can testify this is an absolutely true story. So many years ago, in the early days of Aish Torah, there was a student who came to Aish Torah whose father was a Holocaust survivor. And his father had been raised religious. But in the whole experience of the trauma he had gone through in the camps, he had abandoned religion. And then, to his great surprise and his great concern, his son was in Israel and started to study at this yeshiva called Aish Torah. And it was very disturbing to him. So then the sister came to sort of see what's with her brother, and she started to learn about Judaism. So he's got now, 2 of his kids are now learning Orthodox Judaism in different educational institutions, and he gets on a plane to come to Israel. He comes to Aish Torah, he's standing outside the Beis Medrash, and he's screaming and blaspheming against God. My parents are so religious, I saw all the